Do you need a PhD in robotics? That question has come up a lot lately, and I see it online a lot as well. And I think that's only natural given that robotics is becoming more and more popular. But there's no definitive answer to that question because it really depends on what you want to do in robotics. Do you want any possible role, or do you want a highly specialized, research-oriented role? That question is the driver for whether or not grad school is the right move for you. Okay, let's talk about a PhD and what it looks like, since a lot of people online aren't even sure what it means to get a PhD, so I think we should start there. Generally, what you're doing as a PhD student is reading the most recent research papers on topics in robotics and related fields. A lot of times it's going to be AI or machine learning based, but there are other disciplines of robotics where you'll also be reading papers from outside the robotics field, but will still be relevant to you. And after you read those papers, then you're trying to come up with novel approaches or ways to apply the methods from those papers to different areas of robotics so that you can make some type of contribution to the scientific literature. A contribution generally looks like having some type of hypothesis that you would then design experiments to test. Then you run those experiments, you evaluate your results or analyze your results, and if you have results that are meaningful, then you would go ahead and wrap all of that up into a paper and you would submit that to a conference or a journal. This means that a large part of the PhD is dealing with ambiguity and undefined problems, and then experimentation, and sometimes a lot of effort put in towards something where the outcomes don't provide anything meaningful, and you kind of have to start over again with the process from the beginning. Now, for some people, these types of unstructured, undefined problems are going to be really frustrating and not at all meaningful for them. Some people really value a clear, well-defined problem with well-defined scope and some type of tangible output. And for those people, a research-oriented graduate program like a PhD program probably is not going to be the best fit. On some level in the PhD program, you have to really enjoy reading papers and then trying to do something with what you've just read. You're going to be trying to come up with new ideas, new approaches to things that haven't been done before, and then trying to make those work out and make some type of meaningful contribution. Now, typically, if you're graduating from a PhD program, you're going to be looking at one of two roles or making a decision between one of two different avenues. The first is that you'd be looking at a traditional faculty role where you would become a professor at a university, potentially run a research lab, and then mentor students as they pursue their PhD. The other option would be to go to industry and do an applied science or a research scientist type of role. In those industry type of roles, you would still be looking at less well-defined problems, less well-scoped problems, but you're generally doing something that aligns with the business interests and you're trying to produce some type of valuable output for the business. Getting one of those industry research roles is going to be much harder without a PhD than it is with one. You'll be competing for roles with a lot of people who do have a PhD, and so typically they will have had more time to develop a research portfolio, they will have more publications and potentially more experience under their belt in a certain field than you would if you didn't have a PhD. It's still not impossible to get into a research role without a PhD. I do know of some students who did a master's program and they did a research-oriented master's program where they had a master's thesis, and they were able to get an industry research role, but it will be more challenging without the PhD. Okay, so that's the first part. What is a PhD and who is typically pursuing a PhD and why you would do a PhD instead of just going right to industry. So let's say you aren't interested in pursuing a research-oriented role. You just want an industry role related to robotics. There's a few paths here. So first off, many companies have a robotics technician role or some type of field robot technician. Technician roles are typically open to people with just a bachelor's degree, so you could probably get into those roles without needing any type of graduate school. These are generally more hands-on roles where you are fixing robots in the field. These are generally more hands-on roles. Sometimes you'll be out in the field fixing robots. Sometimes you'll be on a manufacturing floor or in some type of facility like a warehouse facility. The picture gets a little trickier when you start talking about software and hardware roles in robotics. Now, hardware is not my area of expertise, so I don't want to offer a lot of commentary on that because I don't want to give you inaccurate information. But software roles I can speak to a little bit more. In my experience, my personal experience, getting a robotics software engineering role without any experience or without graduate school was quite challenging. I came from a general back-end software engineering background with a little bit of embedded systems experience, and I was trying to get a robotics software engineering role, but I was competing with people who were coming out of master's programs or who had lots of hands-on robotics experience. So naturally, I wasn't a very well-qualified candidate for those roles. I decided to do a master's degree for reasons that will probably take up a video in and of themselves. But along the way, I discovered research and I met a couple of professors who I thought would be really interesting professors to work with and good advisors. That sort of tracked me into the PhD program, and I ended up having those faculty members as my PhD advisors, and that's how I ended up here in a research-oriented PhD role. So tying all of this back together, when you are deciding whether or not you need a PhD for something, you should be asking yourself whether or not you want a research-oriented role or you want a more traditional outcome-oriented, deliverable-oriented role. If you're leaning towards a research role, ask yourself how much you like to read, because you're going to be reading a lot of papers. And it's okay if reading is a skill that you are going to develop and get better and better at. For most of us, that is the case. We become better at it through the course of our PhD. But if you don't enjoy reading at all, and the thought of reading papers sounds really monotonous and boring to you, I can almost guarantee that the PhD program will be a pretty miserable experience for you. If you're someone who prefers clear scope, a clear problem, and clear deliverables, and you want a tangible product as an output, I would probably recommend that you head towards the industry track and avoid going into a PhD program. That being said, there are a lot of candidates who have a master's degree, so it probably will become important for you to complete additional coursework in robotics, specifically like in a field that you're interested in, maybe specializing in computer vision or specializing in control theory. That's going to be important for you to be competitive for most candidates. So I think the outliers would be students who went to a very competitive undergraduate program and did a lot of hands-on robotics software engineering during their degree. And you probably have a little bit of a portfolio that you can showcase to an employer. That's a candidate with just an undergraduate degree who would probably be pretty competitive. But if you aren't that person, then a master's program, or at least spending a year developing robotics projects, hands-on robotics projects, is going to be really, really important. Because what I've noticed is that employers are biasing towards people who've worked with real robot hardware, and that's because it's tricky and has a lot of problems associated with it. Okay, this is all just my 2 cents as somebody who went from software to a robotics PhD program. So if you have different experience, I would love if you shared that in the comments, because people who are going to watch this video might be able to benefit from your experience and see that there are different avenues than just what I'm saying. When you leave your experience, you never know who you might be helping, and it's a really great way to just give back to someone else based on your own experiences. Okay, so I hope that helps you understand the process a little bit more. If you still have questions, please leave them below and I will try to answer them as soon as I can. Thanks so much. I'll see you in the next one.